The other piece of awareness is being aware of the situation, whether it's the organization or the board that you're sitting on, or being aware of the other party in the difficult conversation, being
Hmm.
aware of what that other viewpoint is, um,
Yeah.
being aware maybe of the other ways you could get rid of a C5 tail stand.
Welcome to the art and science of difficult conversations. I'm Chris.
And I'm Lucy, and we love having difficult conversations.
That's right. And each week we'll either share a tip, hear how others have gotten better at difficult conversations, or demonstrate common difficult conversations and what to do and what not to do.
Let's get into it.
Elise, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Chris, for having me.
Yeah, everybody, to all our listeners, Elise is a nonprofit consultant. She's a speaker, she's an author, a published author, and she's a president of Woodworth Enterprises. And she has a passion for helping nonprofits just like I do. And so it's a honor to just be able to speak with you today, Elise.
Well, I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah, so I don't want to share too much about your story because it's your journey. So I'd love to have the listeners just hear, how did you get to where you're at? What's your journey been like?
Sure. Our journeys, I think we can all relate to the circuitous nature of life. No one, or I sure didn't, when I was growing up, when someone said, "What do you want to be?" I never said, "Oh, I can't wait to help nonprofits do better at achieving their mission." But I have found a passion for it, and I'm so glad to do that. My journey getting there has led me through the Virginia Military Institute, where I received a bachelor's degree in biology. It led me through learning how to be a leader and how to be a logistician in the Air Force. It led me through my MBA studies, where I focused on project management. And it really propelled me, all of these things propelled me to break out and start my own company. In 2014, I started Woodworth Enterprises and really focused on helping organizations, at the time for-profit, mostly contractor type of organizations,
Hmm.
improve their organizational culture, go through change effectively, efficiently. And what that's now translated into is a passion for helping nonprofits learn more about business fundamentals and adopt some of those ideas and concepts into their nonprofit missions so that they can be more successful. Along the way, on a personal journey, my family grew quite rapidly at the beginning of this time where I was starting my company. And in that first 5 years, we also had 5 children. So there
Hmm.
was a lot of pivoting, a lot of maternity leave, and time to think about what it was I was doing. At the same time, I was serving on my first nonprofit board.
Hmm.
And that's where my interest in nonprofits came in. I was invited to be on the board of trustees at the Virginia Military Institute. I was the first female alumni they were inviting. I was the youngest member ever. And I wanted so badly to be an effective board member. I wanted to succeed in that position. But if you're asked to define success as a board member, you're left with a really vague understanding. And when I asked the question, the response was, it'll take you about 2 years to understand what's going on, and then you'll start to see how you fit in. And which is well and good. But what I know now is that there are nonprofits that do not have 2 years to wait for effective, strong board members, which is why a couple of years ago, I sat down and wrote Business Not Battle for Nonprofit Boards. It's effectively how to be an effective board member. It's everything I wish someone would have told me in 2014, and it has become a really great guide. I still use the concepts in it today as I go through things, and I've seen it work for other people as well. So that has been never a straight journey. I never thought I'd write
Hmm.
a book. I never thought I would have a large family. I never thought I'd own a business. And yet here we are.
Here we are. There's two thoughts that come to my mind as you tell your story. Number one, I have two kids and I am so tired. So I can't imagine five kids. How tired you
I
must
sleep
be.
so well. There are parents who say that they struggle with sleep or they're up until all hours. I am down and out pretty much every night at 10:30. There is not much of me left.
Yeah. Because you're just so tired. You can't even think about
That's
it.
the end.
Um, the second thing is, during your introduction, like you have really impressive credentials. And it's also really clear that you're a speaker because you're an experienced speaker because you have such a tight way of sharing your story and pulling a thread throughout it that only comes with experience of you have to tell large groups your story and tell a theme as you're telling your story. If you're not used to it, you're just kind of telling the story sequentially and without like overbroad themes. So I think it's a cool way to just even notice the difference
Well,
of
thank you.
somebody who's an experienced speaker.
Thank
So,
you. And it's something, and it's not something that I picked up overnight. Um, Again, this is 10 years after I've started my company. And if you're out there and you've started a business or you're an entrepreneur, you have an idea, or you're starting a nonprofit, or you're working with a new organization, how you describe that to yourself is so important because how you interact with your description of the mission, and this is something I talk about, mission focus, how you interact with the mission is going to impact how other people see the mission. And so it takes a lot of repetition and a lot of thought and introspection to arrive at a point where you can clearly say, kind of in a nutshell, this is how it's been. This is what I've experienced.
yeah, I love that. And so our podcast is about difficult conversations. And one of the things you wanted to share about, especially because boards are nothing but meetings, because that's how boards work. They just have meetings and committee meetings and never ending meetings of all sorts.
Right.
But you have a particular experience with just having difficult meetings, with having meetings where there's lots of conflict or something difficult has to be brought up. And what's your journey been like with that in terms of kind of how you experience difficult topics in meetings and conflict in meetings?
So maybe you've even experienced this too. And I know I have been in so many of those situations, many of them earlier on in my career, where you're sitting there and a topic comes up, whatever topic it is. And there's a disagreement in the room about how that particular topic should be handled. One particular issue that I encountered while I was in the Air Force was a C5 tail stand. Now, this is a huge scaffolding, permanent scaffolding that they use to put on the back of an airplane, huge airplane, to maintain the tail, to maintain the body of the airplane, all the hydraulics and the different equipment. The C5 had left the base where I was stationed, and we no longer needed the C5 tail stand. And it became this huge issue of how were we going to dispose of it? Were we going to sell it? There were so many different things. And I remember at the time I was not experienced in any sort of professional meeting. And I just remember feeling the tension of the countering ideas of what could be done. And it felt like we had so many meetings about the C5 tail stand that I just got tired of talking about well, not even talking, because I would just come and sit in meetings, but tired of being in those situations, because what I know now is that had become a battle. Those conversations had become a battle where we had differing opinions, and the only point of the meeting was to bring those differing opinions together. Well, that does not further the mission or the goal of getting rid of this piece of equipment. We just ended up in this constant loop of really frustrating conversation where people are talking past one another, not talking
Mm,
to each other. And I wish then I would have had some of the tools I have today, but that's just one example. I think we all have those situations where we can think back into, whether you're buying a car or selling a house, like there are so many different situations where in life you get into these battles. And
mhm,
sometimes they get really sticky and really frustrating and exhausting. And a lot of times we tend to just say, I'm not going to that meeting anymore. I'm not talking to that
mm,
person anymore. I
yeah,
disengage completely, which again does not achieve the mission. I
right.
define business now as the mutually beneficial exchange of products, services, and ideas. Business doesn't have to be about money. It doesn't have to be about progress or any of these ethereal things. It can just be about a mutually beneficial exchange of products, services, and ideas. Sometimes
Mm,
that's money. Sometimes it has a more ethereal feel to it or a more
yeah.
cutthroat feel to it. But we can be in this mindset of what is the goal of the meeting? What is the goal of this conversation? And how can we advance that?
Yeah. Let me just jump in there because I think I just read an article from MIT about the phenomenon of the meeting after the meeting, where people who are the feeling disengaged and angry about the stuff, they have their separate meeting afterwards, the like a sense making meeting
Hmm.
to just essentially vent because they couldn't do it during the meeting or talk about it. I'm interested. I'm wondering because you felt that tension, you were able to feel it when you were growing up. I guess what were you taught, either explicitly or implicitly? What were you taught about tension or conflict or these high emotions?
So interestingly, I'm not a confrontational person by
Hmm.
nature. I think I have always strived for the path of least resistance. I've always strived for or resolved to find the silver lining in issues or ways that we can bridge gaps. So I have a natural tendency to, when I experience that tension, to want to try and fix it or dissolve it, which I'm finding is not as common as I would have thought because it is who I am. I'm finding that not everybody is that way.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Like in the military, I've never been in the military, so my only experience of it is that it's a very hierarchical or very highly structured setting. In that setting, you have that. It sounds like you have that tension. You want to fix it. You want to move stuff forward. You're feeling the tension because you're just going in circles. And so, how do you sit with that feeling of I want to move this forward, but I can't because it may not be my place necessarily to do that?
And that's the meeting after the meeting that you talked
Yeah,
about.
yeah.
um, so there are a number of different tactics for those types of situations where you might not have the actual authority, the legitimate authority. You might be
Hmm.
outranked in a particular situation where you're not the director, you're not the chief, you're not the commander, what have you,
Hmm.
but you have the idea or you have a way, an idea that you see could be a solution. And it's important in those times to find very tactful ways to introduce that. And usually it's
Hmm.
in that meeting after the meeting, or if you can find time to plant that idea of a seed, or the
Hmm.
seed of the idea rather, in someone's mind, or why don't we do it this way? Offer those different solutions and have those conversations. Sometimes they're outside the boardroom, sometimes they're outside the meeting.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in that situation with that particular project you were trying to solve, whatever ended up happening?
We ended up, it ended up becoming a DRMO, and I can't remember the acronym now, but it was essentially sold and um, dismantled for scrap, I think was was the end result of that. And then
Yeah,
what was all that? What was all the contest for? What was the battle, the
right.
struggle for? And it really, to me, I'm looking back at this saying, we wasted a lot of breath talking about this problem that
Yeah.
we had. And I was really glad to see that we were successful in getting it off the
Yeah.
base. So
What helped you? I guess because you eloquently described like your definition of business and how you get everybody focused on moving forward. What was a transformation for yourself to internally think about how you even get to that point or how you even conceptualize that turn?
So one of the things, and I learned this in talking with my dad, actually. He was in a management position in food processing. And he had this card that had a list of questions on it. And the questions were related to problems that came up in the factory. And he would give this out to his managers and say, don't come to me with a problem until you've answered or can answer all of these questions. And so I took that and I started to look at it from a less manufacturing standpoint, more organizational culture. That's what I was into, organizational leadership. Yeah. How can questions be helpful? And there was a meeting that I will never forget. I put an example of it in my book, and I'll share it here as well. I had been asked to be on a committee where the membership of the committee had really started to wane. The mission had become lost in a lot of flowery words, and there was really no engagement. There was no movement towards the mission for this committee, and I'd been asked to sit in and see what I thought and what I could do. Mm-hmm. And a few months in, the chair of the committee decided that we would just start over. We would just start with a new mission. There was a lot of conversation and preparation around this meeting. We're going to talk about the new mission, what our mission will be going forward, and then ideally how we can get people back involved with this committee. So we have the meeting, and we're sitting in this meeting scheduled for 1 hour. And the handful of folks that show up normally. And we start to have the conversation about what the mission should be going forward. And that's when one of the members of the committee starts in with the entire history, all the decisions that she had been a part of and where people had made bad decisions, and let's just drag up all the dirt. Let's just open up the chest. Mm-hmm. Let's just all the skeletons out of the closet. And I started to feel that tension again. I started to feel that. And I said, we're not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to sit here through this. I am now in a position where I can help, where I can change things. And I thought of a thoughtful question. So I waited for her to take a breath in her recitation of the destructive history of this poor committee. And I said, that's all good. I'm really glad that you have that history, that you know that history. And I think it's really great that you're here, that you're still here. But today we're talking about the mission forward. So if you had to, what would you say the mission of this committee should be? What should it be? And then we were silent. I was silent. Mm-hmm. And it was a little awkward at first. There's always the little awkward moment. Sure. When you ask a thoughtful question, because there's thinking. You have to think to answer it. It's not a yes or no question. It's not something that I just have a whip answer to. She had to think about it. Mm-hmm. And she went on to describe a mission that became the foundation for the mission we decided on in that meeting. And I was so
Hmm.
proud of that moment.
Awesome.
And for the committee, mission moving forward, great. I kind of stepped back, having set them in a different direction. But really, I hadn't done anything but change the focus from battle to business. And I did that with a thoughtful question.
Hmm. And is that something that you just thought of in the moment, or is that something that you had been taught or seen somewhere else?
Well, I think from listening to my dad talk about how he used questions to solve
Yeah.
problems and just kind of adopting that and transforming it into something I could use in a more out of the manufacturing industry, where you're not so much worried about process and product output, but you're talking about a mission and people and bringing people together.
Hey, Chris here. I really appreciate you listening to this podcast. And if you are listening to this podcast because you're looking to get better at these difficult conversations, well, if you really want to de-escalate difficult behaviors and you want to be assertive without being aggressive and being true to yourself, I have a self-paced course that can really help you, because I know it's difficult being assertive in lots of different situations. If you're at work and you have to give feedback, if you have to deliver bad news to an employee, or deliver bad news to somebody that you care about in your personal life, or you're struggling to deal with defensive or sensitive people who are pushing your buttons and you don't know how to push back. It doesn't have to be that way. There is a world where you can handle these tough emotions with confidence. You can speak honestly and kindly while you're still being assertive. And you have the ability to manage emotional outbursts and stubbornness calmly, because these are things that I've had to overcome and learn. And so this self-paced course goes through all of those things. I've created this trust framework that helps you think through how to prepare for and how to facilitate hard conversations. And you hear a lot of it actually in this podcast as I talk about how to handle difficult conversations in lots of different scenarios. Currently, the course is closed for enrollment. There's a waiting list. If you are interested in learning more, enrollment will open up at the end of August and the beginning of September. So please go to the website. I'll link it down below, and you can learn more about it and join the waiting list if you want to hear more about it. But I'd love to see you there. That's incredible. And so did you ever follow up with her afterwards about how she experienced it, or how anybody else in the meeting experienced that?
Well, I know that the committee was doing a really good job, and they were coming back, and I lost touch with them around the COVID time. I've moved away from that area. So I have lost touch with them, but the change that happened for me there was really an awakening to the power and the impact of what a thoughtful question can do to shift mindset.
Yeah. And is that, so then it sounds like that's what you've brought into, because that's your book, right? From battle to business. So
Yep.
it sounds like you've brought that even that mindset, but also the idea of questions and asking thoughtful questions into helping resolve that conflict or tension inside of a meeting.
And Chris, I will, now that we're talking about it and I'm remembering, I did go through an innovation cohort, which was incredibly transformational in 2018. And questions were a very powerful part of that. And it wasn't just asking questions. It wasn't just question asking. It was, what questions are good questions to ask?
Yeah.
And what I learned in that was really that asking these types of good questions, these thoughtful questions, as I call them, is really a skill that we can develop, that we can work on. And I catch myself now while I'm talking to the children or working with a client, and I'll ask a question and I'll be like, oh, there was an answer in that question. Where I say, have you thought about doing it this way? Well, that's not a thoughtful question. That's a yes or no answer that they can be like, no, I hadn't thought of that. Or, yes, I did think of that. And that's the end. But so really taking time to learn how to ask those thoughtful questions that are going to make people stop and think, that don't have a hidden solution. Have you thought about connecting to so-and-so? Or have you thought about having this type of fundraiser? well, sure, maybe we have. Or then someone starts to get defensive, and that becomes its own difficult conversation because they put up a fence, because now you've come at me with a solution that I missed, obviously, or I would have
Yeah.
implemented it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when you're asking those questions, it has to be something that you do very intentionally, and you're asking those questions to deepen understanding.
Speaking my language, love it. One thing that I just want to make sure I touch, because you mentioned earlier, is you were the first female member of that board of trustees for VMI. I'm wondering, when you're in a meeting and you're maybe the first, or maybe you're just any minority group, anybody that's underrepresented in that group, or you don't hold a lot of power in that group, how could somebody find that confidence to ask that question that might change the trajectory of that tension or that conflict?
I think a lot of it comes from awareness. And again, this is something I learned having the benefit of hindsight, being able to look back on, what do I wish I would have known
Yeah.
when I started? When I started as a new board member, I was afraid to ask questions. I didn't want to seem like I was going to step on someone's toes or make waves or make the meeting go longer or any of these things. Like, why did we invite her to be here?
Yeah.
What I know now is that those were all things I'd put on myself. And I really, anyone listening today that's in a situation where you're in a minority, try to be very aware of what you're putting on yourself versus what other people are actually putting on you. So the first thing I talk about in the book is awareness, and being aware of your skills and your strengths and what it is you're bringing to the table. Like, you were invited to be on a board, you're in the room for a reason. What is that reason? If the reason is to be an effective member of governing an organization, the natural response to that is you might have to ask some questions.
Yeah.
And it might be awkward or difficult or hard. But recognizing and remembering, being able to be aware of and remember your skills, remember your strengths, remember what you're doing there, can be incredibly empowering. And so I encourage anyone starting out in those types of roles to take a step back and think about what your skills are. What are you bringing? And gain your confidence. We know that confidence comes from within, right? Confidence is something you have to find in yourself. It doesn't come from external forces. It comes from success that you have personally. You have that. But to find it, you have to look inside. You have to take a little look inside and see what's in there. See what successes are there that you can draw your confidence from. And so in those times where you get a little bit apprehensive, or you're, I don't know if I should say this or that, pull your confidence from the introspection that you have on yourself, from the awareness. I want to share a little story here,
Yeah,
which
please.
is another one about questions. I was in another meeting, and there had been some organizational change. There had been reorganization. Some new acronyms were showing up on a flow chart they were showing us. And I didn't know what they all were. And maybe I should have. And I felt that like, what is this? What do you mean with these 4 letters? And so I kind of looked around, and everybody else seems like they're following along with the organizational chart. And finally, the 4th or 5th time it was mentioned, I was just like, excuse me, can you just tell me what that means? Can you just tell me where that comes in? Like, what is that position? And it was defined. We moved on. Meeting continues. Fine. All well and good. I didn't think anything else of it until after the meeting, when another board member came up to me and said, I wasn't following that either, but I wasn't going to ask.
Mm. Love that.
Realized in that moment how many questions go unasked. So if you are in a meeting, if you're in a situation and you have a question, you're not sure on something, someone else is probably having that same question. And it was proven in real life to me. I was
In real time, right
in
away.
real time. And
Yeah.
I don't know why I was so surprised, but I was. And that gave me another sort of boost of like, yes, we need to ask more questions.
Mm.
And a lot of times with a nonprofit board, you might be meeting twice a year. Maybe it's quarterly. Sometimes you have boards that meet every month.
Mhm.
But there is no way that you can keep up with all of the things that are going on in an organization
Right.
by interacting with them twice a year or three
Yep.
times a year or even 12 times a year.
Mhm.
Questions are going to come up. And so I encourage board members, especially new board members, when they see something they don't understand, whether it's a financial report that they can't read or follow where all the money is going,
Mhm.
ask the question.
Mm. Yeah.
And sometimes you find that there's no good answer. And so we need to change.
Have you ever read the book Questions Are the Answer?
No, but that sounds fascinating. And I'm going to
I
write
think
it
you would
down.
like that book. It's I forget who the author is, but it's essentially everything you just said and everything I like talking about is the idea that good questions can get you a lot further than just trying to answer a question.
Okay.
And they actually put there's a template they use for a way to have a question brainstorm so that if you're in a group trying to solve a problem, there's a way to facilitate the group where you just have the group come up with as many questions as possible. And through that, you figure out, oh, this is actually the question we need to answer. This one question or two
Oh,
questions.
I
And this
love
is what
that.
we need.
I'm going to check it out.
Yeah,
Thanks.
you should check it out. You talked about that confidence and I appreciated those tips. I think they're really great. In the difficult conversations course I have, one of the things I talk about is preparation as well. Is part of like when you go into difficult conversation, if you are prepared, you're going to feel more confident also. So that makes me think like, is there, did you also change the way you prepare going into meetings that are either be high conflict or maybe not even you didn't even know, but just the way you prepared so that you felt you could manage or facilitate the conversation well?
Spot on. I think, yes. I think everybody who has ever planned to go into a difficult conversation can agree. Like it is so much better to plan to go into a difficult conversation. It is so much more effective, I'll say, to plan to go into those things, those types of situations with a goal in mind, with ideas for what you want to share. And the other piece of it is being open to learning, preparing yourself for whatever those answers to those thoughtful questions can be, because you're not always going to know the answer. I wouldn't have had the foundation for the mission of that committee I talked about earlier. I wouldn't have been able to come up with what she came up with.
Mm-hmm.
But she had the history, she had the experience, she had the knowledge. We had to be as a committee open to the response that she was going to give. And so I think there's a really important piece of preparing yourself, yes, to go into the conversation, but also to receive openly what might be coming back.
Mm-hmm.
There's also an interesting thing that we can examine, an interesting idea around those meetings that need to be difficult. So I talked about board meetings. They're not happening every day. It's not something you don't run into these people every day. But sometimes there are difficult conversations that need to be had. And what's unique about nonprofits and why I've started to focus more intently on bridging these gaps in the nonprofits is that their organizational structure is usually such that a board hires a CEO or a president or an executive director, and that director runs the organization. But if that organization needs something, or the director needs support in some way, they have to come to the board to get it.
Mhm.
But what that can create, and frequently does create, honestly, is the situation where the director doesn't want to share what's wrong.
Mm.
Maybe the board doesn't even really want to hear it. They
Yeah.
just want the solution.
Yep.
And so this problem continues, this battle grows, and sometimes it's the end of a nonprofit.
Hmm.
If
Hmm.
the conversation that needs to happen is around funding or around fundraising, or it's around networking and outreach. How do I do these things? I need you to open doors for me, but I don't know how to ask you because there's this huge gap between us.
Yeah.
Also, I don't
Yep.
want you to fire me
Hmm.
because you think
Right.
I'm not doing a good job. So there's a tendency when a board meets to take a lot of time sharing the good, wonderful things that an organization is doing or that a committee is doing, and glaze over some of the problems. And done well enough, no questions asked, those battles continue.
Mm.
I've worked with a particular group that our first meeting together, I asked a very common consulting question: where would you like to be in 1 year? Where,
Yeah.
what's the
Sure.
ideal place for you 1 year from now? And all 5 board members said, off the board.
Fair enough.
And so I said, great, let's get started. If we're going to, and so the way I approached it was really from if you're all going to be off the board, we need to set up a framework, a process, procedures. We need to capture what it is you're doing so that you can transition off.
Yeah.
If that's what you want. And
Right.
so that's what we did. And it was in doing that and going through the hard work. It is hard work, especially when your board is volunteers and they're doing this on their own time.
Right.
To go through what are the processes and procedures that we're doing to run this organization, document those. I was able to put them into a procedures document, very Air Force thing to do of me.
Yeah.
Standard operating procedures. And from that, we were able to identify probably about 20, 25 different volunteer roles that could be delegated to other people in the organization.
Mm.
And so from this overworked, stressed out group of 5 board members who were doing everything,
Sure.
there's now an umbrella of volunteers picking up little pieces of processes and procedures and running the organization beautifully. And I was really happy to see at the end of that year that only 1 board member rolled off for family reasons, obligations, and 2 new board members came on. So the organization is growing and healthy, and so it's because their board took the time, rolled up their sleeves, did the hard work. We were meeting every 2 weeks.
That's a lot.
It was a lot.
That's a lot.
And they were doing a lot of work and keeping things going, but that they were able to share those things, those roles, those responsibilities, those stresses. And there's still a little work to be done. And some of the roles are bigger and need more thought put into them as they're delegated and split up. But I was so pleased to see them take ownership again of the organization and realize that what had become a have to meet with these people again. I don't want to talk about another fundraiser with these people because I'm exhausted. My family's
Right.
exhausted. We're all exhausted. We're all stressed. We're all frustrated. We're all in battle. But by refocusing on the mission, you
Mm.
can be in business.
I love that. That's awesome. I think that's such good work. I can't say enough about it. And so I'm wondering, for the people that are listening, let's say, what are 1 to 2 takeaways that you have for anybody listening that they can immediately start doing to would have the most impact of them being confident in these hard conversations in meetings?
Absolutely. I think the first key takeaway is awareness, that awareness piece
Mm.
of your skills, your strengths, where your confidence comes from, where your successes are, where they have come from, where your strengths are, and how you can use those strengths to be effective for the organization. The
Mm.
other piece of awareness is being aware of the situation, whether it's the organization or the board that you're sitting on, or being aware of the other party in the difficult conversation, being
Mm.
aware of what that other viewpoint is,
Yeah.
being aware maybe of the other ways you could get rid of a C5 tail stand, and not so much focused on your own opinion, but aware of the mission enough
Mm.
and confident in yourself enough to go out and find the best way forward. So that's the first key takeaway. And the second is really plays on the mission focus. And it's kind of goes back to being aware of that mission, but defining it. Define
Mm.
the goal for your conversation, the goal for the meeting. What outcome do you want from this conversation? Is that the outcome that the other party wants as well?
Mm.
So think about that mission, and it's in that awareness and in that focus that you can find resolution, that you find the path forward for that difficult conversation or that difficult meeting. And it doesn't become so much a personal conversation anymore. It's not, what bad decisions did you make 6 months ago that have
Mhm.
caused the committee to disband? Pardon me. But what can we do moving forward to make it better?
I love those takeaways. I think they're so powerful and they're so easily overlooked because people when emotions are flying high, they just want to get into it and just try to solve it as soon as possible.
Mhm.
And I think you're right. The awareness, taking time to slow down and even think through these things can make a world of a difference.
And the other plus one, this is like the bonus
Yeah,
takeaway,
please.
is in the thoughtful questions.
Mm.
Thinking about not what question can you ask to get your solution, but what question can you ask to get the best solution for the organization, for the
Mm.
conversation, the meeting, what have you.
Yeah.
What are those questions that are going to get the best response, the best momentum?
Mm.
Not what questions are going to prove you right, or what questions are going to prove you are smarter or better or faster or stronger, but what questions are going to be the most effective at finding a solution to the problem.
Mm. Elise, this was a great conversation. Obviously, we're in the same field, so I love this stuff. But if people wanted to learn more about you, to talk to you, to work with you, where can they find you? Where can they follow you?
Very easily at elisewoodworth.com. That has a lot of my speaking topics, and you can book a call. I'm happy to chat with anyone. Obviously, as Chris knows, and as we've demonstrated here, I get really passionate and excited about talking about and unlocking battles that exist in our nonprofits and on boards. And so if that is something that you want to talk about, or you have an idea about, or you disagreed with anything I've said, I welcome the conversation. Let's learn together. So you can go on, again, elisewoodworth.com and book a call with me, and let's chat.
Awesome. We'll put that in the show notes. Are you also on LinkedIn or anywhere else that people can find you?
Absolutely. Connect with me on LinkedIn. My book, Business Not Battle for Nonprofits and Their Boards, is available on Amazon and Audible, as well as iTunes, and you can buy it directly from me. On my website, I offer a bulk discount, and if you do order it directly from me, I have the chance to autograph the locally printed copy.
Oh, nice. Awesome. Well, Elise, thank you so much for being here, for being willing to share your wisdom and your experiences. I appreciate you coming on today.
Chris, thank you for tackling difficult conversations, because it is so much easier to turn away from them, to sweep them under the rug, not to give them the spotlight or attention. And so I really am glad and thankful to have been a part of this podcast and of this movement towards, tackling what can be very difficult situations.
Thank you. And hopefully we'll have you back in the future too, if you're willing.
Yeah, that'd be great.